We live in an unbelievably complex world. The world has never been more complex, but we've never done it where we're just doing that through people screaming at each other for 2 minutes on Surrounded, or people singing songs on TikTok or whatever. This is like this is a crazy experiment that we're going through right now.
Yeah, it makes sense that what we're putting in structures our internal world, right? Like I live in
Yeah,
Japan, and it's so beautiful here, and the the country's so rich in culture. There's many things to explore and to see, and I'm forcing myself to see new things and to experience like new stuff all the time. And often when I do that, the first thought that enters my mind is, how can I turn this into an appealing Instagram post? Instead of like, how can I be in the moment, or what can I take out of this experience, or how am I going to remember this? The first
yeah.
thought is like, how can I make this seem really cool on an Instagram story so people will think I have a really cool life. And
Yeah, I
and
mean, you're
it's a
very far from the only
horrifying
one.
it's a horrifying thing. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. But I'm probably not the only one, right?
No, I'm totally guilty of all this too.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, in the article, you say it's not just about reading, is it? It's about the cognitive ability that reading sustains, right? And sadly, you've brought some receipts about our recent IQ scores as well. I
Yeah,
don't want
there's
you to reveal them, but we kind of have to do that.
yeah, no, there's been some really interesting work on this too. There's a great article which I'd encourage everyone to look up called "Have Humans Passed Peak Brain Power" by a journalist called John Ben Murdoch, who works at the Financial Times. He does data journalism, and that's measuring things like the decline of PISA scores, which is the kind of global benchmark test for students. Those have been declining since those scores in things like maths, reading, and science have been declining since the early 2010s. There's other reports that's found performance in reasoning and problem solving tests is declining, not only in adolescents but in adults as well. And the other thing, which is really alarming, are these what we're seeming to see, which is data that suggests that IQ is declining as well. There's a phenomenon called the Flynn effect, which describes the way that basically the whole of the 20th century IQ increased year on year. People were always getting smarter as measured by IQ, better nutrition, longer time spent in education, all this kind of stuff. That effect now seems to have gone into reverse, and all of these trends come back to the early 2010s, which is the point in society at which smartphones became widespread. One of the points that John Ben Murdoch makes, and I think rightly, is that you don't have to necessarily. I mean, I suspect this is true because I think the IQ data is alarming. But even if you don't necessarily think that people are getting stupider, it's definitely true to say that we live in an environment which makes it impossible for us to fulfill our full intellectual capacities. One of the absolute foundational things of complex thought, of um, deep and meaningful creative activity is attention, is concentration. And if you can't concentrate for long periods of time, you can't fulfill your potential. If you're always checking your phone, and if you're unable to leave your phone for an hour, you're never ever going to be able to have that full, enriching immersion in deep thought, in creative activity, in those kinds of um, states of mind from which basically I think all the greatest achievements of humanity spring. It's rich attention is such an important part of every human achievement, every invention, every great book, every piece of music, and yeah, our ability to fulfill that potential is just being really eroded.
And does the widespread use of smartphones kind of coincide with all of these like horrible statistics that you outlined?
Yes, yeah, I think it does. So the iPhone was invented in 2007, and a lot of these trends begin to kick in the early 2010s, which is basically when smartphones begin to become widespread in society. It's probably about that time that I first got a smartphone, maybe sometime around 2012, 2013. And as soon as we have these ubiquitously distracting devices that stop us reading, that stop us concentrating, that feed us, an increasingly inane diet of, what is basically incorrectly called slop, scores of intelligence, attention, reasoning skills just begin to decline. It used to be, I think this used to be more controversial to say. And when I first started writing about this, I used to get pushback. People saying, is it to do with the different ways that reading is taught in the schools? Is it to do with, a switch from phonics to other reading systems in schools? I think it's now pretty much accepted that it's obviously phones. We've not really seen this before. The effect across virtually every country, this is happening, and it's just remarkable. It's, I think, pretty much unprecedented in our civilization. We've just never been down this road before, where we all have access, and I mean, having a smartphone is becoming virtually compulsory in society, to these addictive entertainment devices that are making us stupider. I think it's just such a sinister and frightening moment for our civilization, and we really have to wake up to how serious this is.
On the new media we're consuming now, like on YouTube, on Instagram Reels, TikToks, what have you, people are obviously much less articulate, as we discussed before, than they would be if they were writing an essay. Their arguments are also clearly much worse, and yet they seem more convincing, more impactful somehow. Why do you think that is?
It's such a good point. And this is actually, I mean, I think this is almost one of the key points about the differences between what's called oral societies that communicate mainly through conversation and speech, and literate societies, which is the society we lived in probably until 5 or 10 years ago, in which discourse and public conversation and communication is structured by print and people communicating in text. So the point that Walter Ong, this great media theorist, a brilliant book called Orality and Literacy, which I highly recommend, the point that he makes in this book is that if you're communicating to someone face to face or in person, and I guess this also obviously goes for if you're communicating with someone over a screen on TikTok, via YouTube, and you want to persuade them of a point, say you want to tell them that vaccines cause cancer, or that the moon landings never happened, or the earth is flat. If you want to persuade someone of this kind of zany point, there is a whole array of persuasive techniques available to you. So you can make your argument kind of logically or rationally. But if you're talking to someone in person and you want to impress them with a point, you can shout at them, you can cry, you could, if you're a charming person, you could be very charming and you could be kind of funny and witty about it. You could persuade them with a display of your social status. Human beings are very conscious and tuned into status displays. So if you're an impressive person, you're really tall, you're really respected, you're really good looking, you can use those things to your advantage to persuade someone of a point. And we know this happens because we see this happen in conversations all the time. People will agree with like the most charming or good looking person or the most charismatic person, even if what they're saying is nonsense. I think everybody's seen that. What this means is that communication in oral cultures, so cultures before the arrival of print, is much less rational, because if you want to persuade someone of something, you've got all kinds of emotional and non-rational techniques with which to persuade them. What print does, and anybody who's ever tried to write anything persuasive in print, I do it every week, an opinion columnist, is it strips all those extra rational persuasive techniques away from you. And I'm very much not saying that print is like a perfect medium of communication, that it's perfectly logical, that it's perfectly rational, but it is much more rational than speech. And you know this if you've tried to write. If you're trying to persuade someone in print, you can't shout at them, you can't cry at them, you can't charm them. All you can do is like fit one sentence after another, sentence after sentence after sentence after sentence. And it's very hard to do. And if your argument doesn't logically add up in print, you're very exposed. And it's very obvious to readers, and people can see the logical um, breaks in your argument. They can see where you've skipped over a point. They can see where there should be more evidence. I write an opinion column every week, and I am so aware of this because I get told by readers when I've missed stuff. Um, None of that applies in conversation. None of that applies in a TikTok video. Uh, and you can directly see the difference if you, for instance, take like a Joe Rogan monologue or a Candace Owens monologue and you write it down and print it off onto a piece of paper and try to read it. It makes no sense at all. It's full of like logical discontinuities. It's full of random assertions that are never evidenced. It's full of ideas that just arrive out of nowhere and then disappear. It's totally illogical. And if you tried to print that stuff in a newspaper every day, you would go bankrupt because people would say, what on earth is this? This makes no sense at all. This is totally unreasonable. Why am I paying for this? When this kind of information, this very poor quality, very um, illogical information is communicated via screens, we're much more persuaded by it because people can
Right.
be really charming with it and they can be funny. And like Joe Rogan is a charming guy, but he says a lot of nonsense. And if we lived in a world in which YouTube and podcasts didn't exist, he wouldn't have a career because the
Right.
stuff that he says and the way that he structures his information, it wouldn't pass muster in print.
Yeah.
And the ultimate test of this is anybody who, you know, it's much harder to bluff your way through a topic writing an essay about it than it is in conversation. You can get by on anything in a conversation, roughly saying kind of plausible sounding shit and just sort of moving on. You can't do it in an essay. Print is just so much more demanding. And a culture which is structured by newspapers and magazines, every single person contributing to discourse is held to this minimum standard of rationality. I'm not saying it's super high. I'm not saying every newspaper is like the most logical thing in the world. They're definitely not. But there is like a minimum standard of rationality in our culture. And when you move from this literate culture that we've had for hundreds of years to this post-literal or kind of oral culture again, that is out the window, and the quality of our discourse has just fallen off a cliff. And this is just so dangerous for our society.
This is going to be a bit counterproductive for me, but podcasts are a bit of a scourge here, aren't they? You mentioned Joe Rogan. You can see what you were describing in action there, because he's going to host some amazing archaeologist from Yale one day, and then on the next show he's going to host some conspiracy theorist Graham Hancock or somebody.
Yeah,
And it's like the last Graham Hancock is gonna completely wipe his mind off, like completely delete everything that he knows through conversation from the previous guy who was an actual archaeologist. And you see that like he had like thousands of episodes yet, but you can say that Joe Rogan is much more knowledgeable or articulate now after all of these like episodes that he did with
it's
actually
such
smart people.
it's really
Yeah,
true. And you can see that sometimes someone like Joe Rogan or another kind of podcaster will have two people on. One of them will be an expert, one of them will be a nut job, and they'll debate. And the nut job will be more convincing
yeah.
because there's not a format that rewards the most logical and the most evidenced person. It's a format that rewards often the most charismatic or the most fluent person. And those things don't map onto whether your idea is better or not at all.
Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, follow and rate on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Marketing tutorials insist. It's really, really important that I hassle you about that. So I am doing it. Also, if you'd like to, please support me on Patreon. It's a big help. This is a one-person podcast. I do everything by my little old self. There's no team behind me. Nobody. Very, very sad, I know, but you can help by hopping on Patreon and finding the Smart Cookies podcast on there. And then last, but certainly not least, I have to thank my existing patrons, Tovarishin Tovarishice. Without you, there would be no Smart Cookies podcast, which makes you actual producers of this show. So eternal thanks goes to Luke Johnson, Jim Bird, Bewildered Beauty, Davorin Paulica, Dale and Mia, Chert Gosar, Sasha Sodia, Richard, Amy Ons, Mattia Renchel, Florian Hauer, Peter Karba, Matija Zopancic, Dejan Žulnir, Tarej, Rok Tržan, Saša Vipatnik, Neven Cvijanović, Juš Premrov, Sirkezi, Goran Ivašić, Anže Sever, Ole, Marin Ferrara, Aljaš Mahar, Štrole, Ajda Mancian, Miha Medved, Medinho, Goran, Gordan, Lorenzo, Jure Čuk, Mila, Carmen, Veronica, and Tai Chi. Oof, thanks, you absolute legends. I am deeply, deeply touched. Means a lot.